Well, I want to thank everyone for being here and the staff at Wheatland and Lancaster History for having me, especially Patrick Clark for putting all of this together. It's really a big honor to be here and have a chance to reflect on the 1850s and on James Buchanan and on Southern Unionism. It especially means a lot to me to be here in a community that has such a great history, in particular watch history. I'm a big collector of watches. And whenever I got tenure a few years back, one of the things that I bought was a watch to celebrate, and it was a Hamilton, and I wore it tonight. So um, it was a big honor whenever Patrick wrote me. I just absolutely love Hamilton watches, and it was very nice to have him reach out. And I wanted to tell you all that little story. Yeah, so he mentioned the book that I'm working on right now, and it looks at Union Army commanders, admirals and generals who were born in the American South. And it's been taking me a long time because there were far more than even I thought. And I've been learning so much new about a war that I thought I understood quite well. And, I've been studying the American Civil War since I was about 9 years old. My mom gave me my very first paper whenever I got my PhD. She held on to it all those years. And when I got hooded back in 2009, she hands me this paper, and I'm like, what is this? And it was a paper that I had written when I was 9 years old. And it said, The Civil War by Barton Myers. And so that's my backstory. I've been doing this a long time, but I've never had a chance to really sit and reflect on Buchanan in a sustained way until Patrick wrote me. And I'm really happy he did because I'm going to be able to use this now forever for all of my students. Whenever I go into the classroom, they're going to have to study Buchanan in depth for a sustained period of time. So thank you all for being here this evening and having me here. This talk's a little long. It's got a little humor in it though. So I'll try to do my best to keep you all awake while I'm here. So we focus a lot in America on winners in American history. We do. Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt. They get so much of our attention in conversation and in class, a lot. Not so much on the less successful in our past. It's worth doing this since it brings a better sense of humility, I think, to understanding our great American story. James Buchanan lost a lot during his life, even when he became the most powerful person in the Republic. So what can his life, and more specifically, his handling of the secession crisis teach us today? And I think it's very difficult to understand the period of the 1850s, the decade of the 1850s, without understanding James Buchanan and his position. And the decade of the 1850s is one of our most complex in American politics, and therefore it deserves a good look right now as we encounter such a difficult period in our own history with politics. Again, we have third parties that mattered in American politics on the national stage during the 1850s. We have the rise of a new political party in the Republican Party, the death of an old political party, and the second party system in the Whig Party, all important. And then we have the National Democratic Party implode in 1860 on its own weight. So we have a lot going on in the 1850s, and that decade is so critical and one that is impossible to understand without Buchanan's story. Now, I'd like to begin by quoting a short passage from one of Buchanan's most famous public addresses. Now, this one from January 8, 1861, entitled Message on Threats to the Peace and Existence of the Union. Now, in my annual message, I expressed the conviction, which I have long deliberately held, and which recent reflection has only tended to deepen and confirm, that no state has a right by its own act to secede from the Union or throw off its federal obligations at pleasure. I also declared my opinion to be that even if that right existed and should be exercised by any state of the Confederacy, the executive department of this government had no authority under the Constitution to recognize its validity by acknowledging the independence of such state. Now, this left me no alternative as the chief executive under the Constitution of the United States, but to collect the public revenues and to protect the public property so far as this might be practicable under existing laws. This is still my purpose. And my province is to execute, not to make the laws. It belongs to Congress exclusively to repeal, to modify, or to enlarge their provisions to meet exigencies as they may occur. I possess no dispensing power. I certainly had no right to make aggressive war upon any state. And I am perfectly satisfied that the Constitution has wisely withheld that power even from Congress. But the right and the duty to use military force defensively against those who resist the federal officers in the execution of their legal functions and against those who assail the property of the federal government is clear and undeniable. The Union is a sacred trust left by our revolutionary fathers to their descendants. And never did any other people inherit so rich a legacy. It has rendered us prosperous in peace and triumphant in war. President James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan was born at Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, 1791. Buchanan was the last American president born in the 18th century. In his 20s, he heeded the call of the War of 1812 and joined a regiment, but he did not see military action in the war. Short time later, he became a highly successful lawyer, a man whose legal talents built him a substantial fortune of more than $250,000 by 1819. He began a political career in the dying Federalist Party of George Washington and was elected to the Pennsylvania legislature following the war. A great personal tragedy struck him, however, with the death of Anne Caroline Coleman, a young, wealthy woman Buchanan had courted, but whose family disapproved of the match. Now, after her abrupt death, devastated, Buchanan threw himself into his work and was eventually elected to the United States Congress, then supporting the new political party of Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party. Now, Buchanan eventually grew into one of the party's most important leaders in Pennsylvania and the northern states. And when Jackson was elected president, he appointed Buchanan, known for his work in foreign affairs and constitutional law by this point, to be envoy to Russia. Now, in the 1830s and early 1840s, he served as a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania and then was tapped by President James K. Polk as Secretary of State during the Mexican War. President Franklin Pierce would appoint him as minister to the United Kingdom from 1853 to 1856, another important foreign policy posting. Now, this is an impressive resume. It'd be an impressive resume for anyone in American political history. The impressive resume in public service made him one of the most experienced people to run for president and win it by the time he assumed office. Buchanan defeated former Whig President Millard Fillmore, a know-nothing by that point, and military hero John C. Fremont, the Republican Party's first presidential nominee to become president. Buchanan became president in March of 1857. Now, Pennsylvania was all important and key to that victory. PA was a key state in this win with 27 electoral college votes. Just 35 more electoral college votes would have given John C. Fremont the victory and the presidency. So keep that in mind, just how close that 56 election was and how important Pennsylvania is going to be in that vote tally, that electoral college vote tally, and just how close it was. Now, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Potter argued in his magisterial work, The Impending Crisis, perhaps the best book ever written on the 1850s in American political history, for a careful examination of contingency. He argued for a look at contingency in the 1850s and what could have possibly happened within reason. Potter also argued that the Democratic Party spiked both of its most important unifying policies during this period: Manifest Destiny, the expansion of America's borders to the Pacific and perhaps beyond, and popular sovereignty, allowing the people within the territories to decide the destiny, in this case of slavery, sometime during the statehood process. Now, by tainting both with a pro-slavery slant, they spiked both issues. unifying issues for that National Democratic Party. Now, in short, understanding the secession crisis and even Buchanan's own difficult position came from many, many turns and crossroads on the American journey to deal with slavery. It didn't come from just one individual or even one decision alone in the 1840s or 1850s or 1860s. The incident after incident after incident, and president after president saw possibilities for peaceful solution to abolish slavery narrowed considerably. Possibility for gradual emancipation or a gradual end to slavery narrowed considerably. Now, in particular, if we look back a short way into the past, in particular, after the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, which limited conversation at the federal level about solutions, and at the state level in the Upper South considerably. Virginia ceased debating the issue after 1832, and Congress instituted a federal gag rule on the issue later in the decade. Now, for most of his presidency, James Buchanan eschewed over agitation. He really eschewed the idea of agitation on the issue of slavery itself, but consistently sided with Southern friends in the government on all issues related to the issue, hoping to tamp down the issue at the national level and contain it to the states. Contain it to the states, because if you were debating it at the federal level, he was concerned it was going to spill over into something far worse, possibly. Secession, maybe. War, Kansas, he saw. Now, during his early months in office, he encouraged Americans to accept the Supreme Court's Dred Scott versus Sanford decision in 1857 to prevent further sectional tension and animosity over slavery. He even worked behind the scenes, we know, to ensure that the outcome of the decision was a pro-Southern one. Now, among other sections, it struck down the old Missouri Compromise line of 3630 as unconstitutional. That was one of the parts of the Dred Scott decision. Now, this decision, often ranked as one of the court's worst by historians, was ultimately a failure in settling the issue, despite its pro-slavery, protectionist, pro-Southern outcome. Now, Buchanan badly underestimated something. And this was interesting. He badly underestimated the Northern resistance to the Dred Scott decision and aversion to any expansion of slavery into the Western territories acquired in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, Buchanan would go on to also support the Lecompton Constitution, the proposed pro-slavery constitution of Kansas, that became one of the roots of a civil war in Kansas in the 1850s and violence there over the expansion of slavery itself. Now, it was ultimately struck down in a referendum in 1858 and also by the United States House of Representatives, but the deed was done. Perhaps the best place for us to begin our evaluation of Buchanan and his own unionism and the sectional crisis in particular, however, in 1860 and 1861 is to examine the cabinet members he selected to provide policy advice to his administration and where their stories on union intersect with the sectional crisis itself. Now, his cabinet is fascinating. It's evidence of both his pro-Southern stance and the problems within the Democratic Party nationally that ultimately lead to its implosion in 1860. Now, Buchanan's decision to not appoint a clear Stephen Douglas man, or Douglas himself, the great advocate of popular sovereignty and the Illinois Democratic senator who defeated Abraham Lincoln for that seat, to his cabinet, gave the balance of power within the cabinet to the Southern wing of the party within the cabinet itself. Now, his appointment of 4 secretaries who were slaveholding Southerners, in addition to John C. Breckinridge, who was also a slaveholder in the antebellum years, was clear. Now, without Douglas's representation, we see a brewing possibility that there would be no Democratic Party unity in 1860. Now, keep in mind, the Democratic Party remained the only national party after the disintegration of the Whigs in the mid-1850s. But unless it rallied to one candidate, a regional candidate was almost certain to win election in 1860. And by 1860, Lincoln's Republican Party was powerful in the northeastern states and the midwestern states. It's a regional party. It's got its biggest power in the Northeast and the Midwest. Eventually, Lincoln gets Oregon and he gets California as well, but they're very small in terms of their electoral contributions. Lincoln wins on the back of the Northeast and the Midwest states. It's a regional party. Now, Lincoln's Republican Party is powerful there. And in November of 1860, Lincoln won democratically with an overwhelming electoral college victory. 180 votes. Only 152 were needed to win the presidency in 1862. He wins 180 electoral college votes. But here's the trick. He only wins 39.8% of the popular vote. Just a little less than 40% of the popular vote, but he wins overwhelmingly the electoral college vote. The turnout for that election was 81.8% of eligible voters. Right? And just think about that, the scale of that. Buchanan's running mate in 1856, the sitting vice president, if we return to the cabinet, and sitting vice president was John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. I've been to Breckinridge's grave. The youngest elected vice president in American history, who did not advocate secession in his own presidential run in 1860, but he was very much an extreme states' rights man, but eventually joined the Confederacy as a general, and he became the Confederacy's final Secretary of War. Now, after Lincoln's inauguration, Breckinridge hoped to avert war, and as a newly appointed senator from Kentucky, worked to try to keep Kentucky neutral for a period. Yet, Kentucky remained in the Union due to the Unionist dominance in the legislature, and eventually Breckinridge's position shifted, and he chose to flee to Virginia and join the Confederacy ahead of possible arrest in Kentucky. You know, Lincoln's sly. He gets around a lot of things in Kentucky. He doesn't need to invade Kentucky in 1861 to hold Kentucky in the Union. He just sends people home. He sends officers of the U.S. Army who were Kentuckians home, and they start raising their own. He doesn't have to send the army in. He can just send folks home that are loyal to the Union at that moment. Breckinridge is in he's on this fence. Now, eventually ending up with the Confederacy. Now, two different secretaries of state served during Buchanan's administration. The first was Lewis Cass. Now, Cass was the most seasoned of these folks, a veteran Democrat. He was an incredibly experienced veteran Democrat, having been the Democratic Party's nominee for president in 1848. He was a sitting senator from Michigan prior to his appointment, and Cass, at 75 years old, was seen as too old for such a demanding position as Secretary of State of the United States. But he was also seen as a good option when Buchanan appointed him for avoiding infighting among Democrats. He was well respected, and Cass resigned in December of 1860 from Buchanan's cabinet because he wanted Buchanan to take a stronger stance against secession and in defense, in particular, of Fort Sumter, the threatened federal installation in Charleston Harbor. Interestingly enough, Cass gets forgotten a lot, but Cass's original idea for how to deal with the institution of slavery and contain it to the states was popular sovereignty. Douglas goes down as the great champion of popular sovereignty, most connected with it, but originally the idea germinates with Cass, even before Douglas popularizes it. Now, to replace Cass in the final months of the administration, Buchanan chose Jeremiah Black, who was his sitting Attorney General. Now, Black was a former Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and was arguably Buchanan's most shrewd and influential cabinet secretary during the secession winter. He advocated reinforcing and defending Fort Sumter. He argued that secession was unconstitutional, but he also argued that coercion of a state was unconstitutional and unlawful as well. Now, when Black became Secretary of State in the final months of the administration, he advocated, you'll love this, for Edwin Stanton to take his place as Attorney General. Now, Edwin Stanton used to practice law in my home county of Harrison County, Ohio. He practiced law in Steubenville in Jefferson County, Ohio before the war. He kind of migrated around politically a lot, but eventually he makes his way all the way to the presidential cabinet. And in early February of 1861, Jeremiah Black was nominated by Buchanan to the U.S. Supreme Court. But his nomination was not confirmed. Stanton, former prosecutor from Steubenville, Ohio, served out the final 2 months of Black's term as Attorney General and would return as Secretary of War, Lincoln's second Secretary of War, and later Andrew Johnson's Secretary of War, who Johnson tries to remove from office, leading to his own impeachment. Now, Buchanan's Secretary of the Interior is one of the most interesting. He was a Southerner, Jacob Thompson. And Jacob Thompson was also a slaveholder who owned a mansion in Oxford, Mississippi. And he openly advocated secession and was appointed as a secession commissioner to North Carolina, his place of birth, all this while a member of James Buchanan's cabinet. He resigns in January, right at the beginning of January 1861, and eventually became an agent of the Confederate government in Canada, working on secret activities to sabotage the Union war effort. He's eventually the head of the Confederate Secret Service in Canada. At one point, he's working on a plot to try to burn down New York City in 1864. We wish we knew more, but a lot of those papers on the Confederate Secret Service operations in Canada got thrown into a fire, we suspect, by Judah P. Benjamin, who was at that point Secretary of State of the Confederacy. Now, 2 men held the post of Secretary of War in Buchanan's cabinet, and they could not really have been more different in policy or in action on the secession crisis and in that winter. Now, Buchanan's first Secretary of War was John Floyd, former governor of Virginia. Now, he also joined the Confederacy, later as a general, not a particularly good one. He doesn't want to go out and surrender Henry and Donaldson, so they send poor Simon Bolivar Buckner out to meet with Grant because he had been friends with Grant and before the war, and he knew him. Floyd's afraid that, if he meets with Grant, there's a good chance maybe that he's the first person arrested for treason. Floyd, whew. Floyd is, whew. He also joined the Confederacy, later as a general, but not before ensuring the movement of weapons from Southern federal arsenals safely fell into secessionist militia hands. Floyd's replacement was his own, Buchanan's own Postmaster General, Joseph Holt, who, along with Stanton, pushed Buchanan to declare secession an unconstitutional act. Now, Joseph Holt would return to Kentucky. He was a Kentuckian. Once Lincoln came to office, working to keep Kentucky in the Union, but was eventually appointed Lincoln's Judge Advocate General of the United States Army, where he worked on some of the most important legal matters the Army would face during the course of the war and later Reconstruction. He becomes essentially the great legal mind of dealing with the challenges the Union Army faced in occupation, in civil military relations. Now, 3 men held the position of Postmaster General. I know Postmaster General is great. It's still a cabinet position in the 1860s, 1850s. Aaron V. Brown, he's the first, Joseph Holt, and Horatio King. Now, Brown was a slaveholder as well and a former Tennessee governor. He serves until his death in 1859, when Joseph Holt selected as his replacement. And when Holt was made Secretary of War after Floyd's resignation, King became Postmaster General. And King, well, he was a postal functionary. He was a strong Union advocate during the Civil War, worked to administer emancipation in Washington, D.C. during the war. But essentially, King was a guy who had worked for the post office his entire life, and finally he gets to the top job right as the sectional crisis happens. So he really is a functionary of the post office system by the time he gets all the way to the top, and may have never got there if it hadn't been such a crisis moment. three different men held the position of Secretary of the Treasury: Howell Cobb from Georgia, Philip Thomas, and John A. Dix. Now, of the members of Buchanan's cabinet, Cobb would have, under normal circumstances, he would have been one of the most likely. He was even, for a time, Buchanan's choice to be his successor. He was highly talented, very talented, graduated the University of Georgia, no bias there on my part. Cobb resigned his post after Lincoln's election and returned to Georgia in early December 1860 to lead its secession effort. His brother, Thomas Reed's Roots Cobb, was already there. He was far more a states' rights secessionist, not so much a national Democrat as Howell Cobb had been. So there's a rift even within the family, but great admiration among the brothers. His brother writes one of the most important legal treatises on the institution of slavery in our history. And they'd both grown up in Athens, Georgia, right next to the university. Now, Cobb resigns his post after Lincoln's election. He returns to Georgia, leads its secession effort, and eventually he would serve as president of the Provisional Confederate Congress and in the Confederate Army as a general. Cobb had been the former Speaker of the House, governor of Georgia. He was even the pick of Buchanan for a time to maybe be his successor. Many people thought in 1861 in the Deep South that the possible president of the Confederacy was maybe going to come out of the Georgia delegation. Georgia's a big population state in the Deep South. It had a lot of successful politicians. You got Alexander Stephens down there. You got Robert Toombs. You got Howell Cobb. You got a deep, deep bench of possible selection choices. But Howell Cobb had run afoul of the really, really fire-eating secessionists earlier on in the decade. In 1851, Howell Cobb wages a brutal election campaign for governor of Georgia. This is before he's in the Buchanan cabinet. And he runs as a constitutional Union Party candidate, and he wins the gubernatorial election in Georgia. And he's governor from 51 to 53. But there was a lot of bad blood with the outright secessionist that he defeated and that wing of the Democratic Party in Georgia, and it costs him later. It costs him whenever he wanted to be, he wanted to possibly succeed Buchanan and get the nomination in 1860. It cost him again whenever he was up potentially right at the top, possibly to maybe get close to leading the Confederacy itself. Every time those things happened, people remembered that he had not passed the litmus test on the secessionist movement in the early 1850s. He had championed the Compromise of 1850. He was a Unionist. He was hard, but he was a conditional Unionist, and that matters. Conditional Unionists, it mattered when the South was coerced, and many of those people begin to come over with moments of coercion. Now, those moments of coercion were different for some people, but that mattered a lot for Howell Cobb. Now, eventually, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi gets the nod and becomes president of the Confederacy, but Alexander Stephens out of Georgia would become the Confederate vice president. So there was some truth to that. The Democratic Party and the Whig Party, Stephens kind of migrates around politically himself, had been a Whig, out of Georgia was very powerful. Philip Thomas, in Buchanan's cabinet, was a former governor of Maryland, and he was appointed treasurer in December and served for only a month. And you're going to understand why here in a moment, why he only serves for a month. He failed to secure a bond to cover the public debt of the United States as Secretary of the Treasury because there was a secession crisis going on. And it was really difficult to sell the idea of a union and a strong union to investors. And he's unable to secure a bond for the public debt. And during the middle of that secession winter, Thomas was regarded as a Southern sympathizer in retirement, however, because he supported his son, who fought in the Confederate Army. He's going to get replaced by John A. Dix, who served out the remainder of the administration and then returned to New York after the Buchanan administration to raise Union regiments for the war effort. Now, Secretary of the Navy, Isaac Toucey, was a former U.S. Senator from Connecticut. Now, Toucey was a moderate Northerner, much like Buchanan in his views, and returned to his legal practice once Lincoln took office. And while not a cabinet secretary, I have to mention, because he's always a big presence in the room when he's there, he's not a cabinet secretary, but the most important military figure and advisor on the military in the nation at the time was General of the U.S. Army, Winfield Scott, who, though a Virginian by birth, he is born on a plantation outside of Petersburg, Laurel Hill. Scott was a Virginian. His father was a Revolutionary War veteran, never owned slaves. He remained loyal as a Unionist and advised Buchanan and Lincoln on military affairs and strategy. Now, it was a diverse cabinet in its views, especially as the crisis worsened, and reflected the wide division in the country after the December 1860 period. On how to hold the Union together, they were not of one mind. Buchanan's own cabinet splitting apart was a strong indication that it would be nearly impossible to hold ardent secessionists in the Union, the fire eaters. But holding conditional Unionists, conditional Southern Unionists who opposed coercion, and neutralists might be possible, he believed. And for a time, his conciliatory attitude, Buchanan's conciliatory attitude, did provide some space for a possible compromise to take shape that secession winter. And the failure of all compromise attempts ultimately resulted in the firing on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops to suppress the rebellion in April of 1861. And those events led to a wider civil war. 60-61. Conditional Unionists want no coercion. What does coercion look like? Well, it might look like calling for troops. That could look like coercion to some people. Conditional Unionists fall away. It's important to keep in mind that by the beginning of February 1861, you've got 7 Deep South states that have left the Union, beginning with South Carolina, ending with Texas. Texas is the 7th star on the Confederate flag. However, only one of those states, Georgia, has a lot of manpower and is in the top 4 states to support the Confederate armies with soldiers during the war. Georgia is the only one of the top 4. The other top 3 are North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. They're 3 of the 4 that go out. Arkansas is the other, that go out after the call for 75,000 troops. If you don't have Virginia and you don't have North Carolina and Tennessee, it's going to be very hard to keep a Confederate army or Confederate armies in the field. All right? There's prestige, there's manpower, there's Richmond, there's Tredegar Iron Works, cannon factory, there's industry. You needed those places if you're the Confederacy to be viable, to have a war. Now, what did Southern Unionists accomplish? Well, ultimately, many Southern Unionists rallied to the John Bell ticket following the old Whig mantle in November of 1860 in the presidency. That was some of the hardcore Whigs. The division in the Whig Party over the Kansas-Nebraska Act issue that killed it nationally meant that support outside the South for Bell was going to be weak and prevented his election. However, that old Henry Clay Whiggish influence was strong enough to prevent Kentucky's secession. And Kentucky's Unionists eventually fielded 60,000 men in the Union ranks, far more if you add the African-American men from Kentucky. It gets up, some estimates put it at close to 100,000 Unionists out of Kentucky serving in the war in terms of regiments. Now, Lincoln believed if he lost Kentucky, and this is important, he lost the war. He saw Kentucky as the center of the country, not just geographically, but like politically. He, at one point in early 61, says, "Gentlemen, I too am a Kentuckian." Right? He's trying to make a point. Hey, I'm a Southerner. I was born in the South. I'm a Unionist, but I'm a Southerner. He's trying to make a point here. Now, Lincoln believed if he lost Kentucky, he lost the war. So this is an incredibly strong endorsement of what Southern Unionists and Border South Unionists could accomplish, did accomplish. They may have prevented an early defeat and crucially aided the success of northern states in suppressing the Confederacy behind the lines during the war. It's very clear from the historic record that James Buchanan did not believe secession was legal. He didn't believe it was constitutional in 1860. It is also abundantly clear that he wanted to avoid a full-scale war between northern and southern states. But for our purposes this evening, it is worth asking the much harder historical question. At the late hour of January 1861 or February or March of 1861, just prior to Lincoln's inauguration, or even in April 1861, following the inauguration, could any American president have averted the war and maintained the antebellum Union of States as it was? In other words, was there a workable compromise? Now, Buchanan's understanding of union was one with slavery intact, Southern, and protected. A return to an early settlement of the issue in 1820 under the Missouri Compromise was what he came back to in early 1861. He circles back to it. He circles back to the 3630 line. Now, there was no specific discussion of gradual extinction of the institution in his message of January 1861. In early January, he's trying to put fires out. He also addressed the idea of where and how a compromise to preserve the antebellum Union could and should emerge, however. The short answer he had was Congress. I should underline that. That's what he thought, Congress. That's where it needed to happen. In his essential compromise, he believed at a fundamental base, a return to the old 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise was going to be the possible way to get there. Now, I've got to, for 1 second, compare him to Winfield Scott, because Winfield Scott also wrote a memoir. And at the end of his life in 1864, he publishes the memoir. It's 2 volumes, not particularly well written. And of course, he dies in 1866. But Scott says that he thinks that the United States missed its greatest opportunity for what it was in the early 1830s, for a gradual end to slavery that would have potentially avoided a war. Okay, that was Scott's idea. That was Scott's projection. That's what he thought. He'd been on the scene as long as anybody. 20 years, he holds the top job in the Army. Right? No one else has ever held the top job in the Army that long. So it's worth thinking about his thoughts as well in comparison here. Now, Buchanan described what he saw as the possibility. So I'll just quote from him. He says, "I therefore appeal, though you to the people of the country, to declare in their might that the Union must and shall be preserved by all constitutional means. I most earnestly recommend that you devote yourselves exclusively to the question how this can be accomplished in peace." Now, all other questions, when compared with this, sink into insignificance. Present is no time for palliatives. Action, prompt action, is required. A delay in Congress to prescribe or to recommend a distinct and practical proposition for conciliation may drive us to a point from which it will be almost impossible to recede. The common ground on which conciliation and harmony can be produced is surely not unattainable. The proposition to compromise by letting the North have exclusive control of the territory above a certain line and to give Southern institutions protection below that line ought to receive universal approbation. In itself, indeed, it may not be entirely satisfactory, but when the alternative is between a reasonable concession on both sides and a dissolution of the Union, it is an imputation on the patriotism of Congress to assert that its members will hesitate for a moment. The failure of the Kentucky U.S. Senator John Crittenden's compromise, that secession winner, was the failure of one of the best chances at averting further secession. Now, at its heart, it wanted a return to the Missouri Compromise with an extension of that line to the Pacific Ocean. Lincoln opposed it for this reason. It also proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would not allow for further congressional effort to end slavery where it was. Now, Buchanan also supported the proposed amendment to the Constitution drafted by the House of Representatives member Thomas Corwin of Ohio. Now, this one, buckle your seatbelts here on this one. This is Thomas Corwin of Ohio. This amendment was passed by both houses of Congress, U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, by March 4th, 1861. Now, Buchanan's last day in office. But it was not ratified by the requisite number of states and came too late in the process to arrest the founding of the Confederacy in early February. Now, the Corwin Amendment, which would have been the 13th Amendment if it had been ratified, read, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with any state, with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." Lincoln seemed more open to this amendment at the moment. That could have been your 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, one lesson, I like the Matthew Brady image the best. That's one of my favorites. It's the hair, I think. Now, one lesson we can take away is this. Buchanan did search for a possible compromise solution in late 1860 and 1861. In other words, he wasn't completely inactive on the secession crisis. And a lot of times I think he gets portrayed as being inactive, even during his lame duck period, not doing enough. Now, sometimes he's portrayed as doing nothing. And I don't think that's a completely fair characterization. He sought expert advice on how to handle the crisis of secession, especially from his attorney general, the person he's supposed to look to for legal advice and constitutional advice. He made a public address to Congress outlining his constitutional position in such a way as to attempt to prevent more secession or war. Now, it's worth remembering that 4 additional states all seceded directly in response to a decision made by President Abraham Lincoln. But a constitutional convention, which Buchanan supported as a solution, never happened. The Crittenden Compromise failed to garner the votes in Congress. Buchanan's strong sympathies throughout his years in office left him obtuse to the growing problems domestically, even within his own party, which failed to unite around one candidate to succeed him in 1860. Now, Buchanan's stance toward settling the issue of slavery by conciliation during his entire presidency did nothing to put the slavery institution on a path to a peaceful, gradual destruction that might have avoided war. That is perhaps his greatest failure. Interestingly, this was also something Winfield Scott lamented in his memoir, this discussion of the 1830s. Buchanan's failed strategy for addressing the slavery issue was about containment of the issue to the states, not a clear, gradual path to an end. Now, Buchanan had been an advocate of territorial division for the Mexican cession, essentially continuing the 3630 line through any new territories acquired for the Mexican War. Following the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state and strengthened the fugitive slave law in the land, he shifted and argued that the states were the location for the conversation about ending slavery or continuing it. He disdained abolitionism as a radical, extreme ideology. His position led to him being labeled a doughface or a Northern politician with sympathetic Southern positions. Essentially, in his own political philosophy, he returned to the 3630 line solution during the secession crisis. He kind of came full circle. Now, another takeaway is this. It's clear that Buchanan did not throw gasoline on the secessionist fire. He desperately wanted to save the Union and avert a wider armed hostility in the United States. Keep in mind, and this is something that I think a lot of people are not aware of, Winfield Scott had advised Buchanan in late October 1860 of the possibility of a horrible war if secession occurred. He was right. Winfield Scott is going to get more and more sophisticated in his projections of how horrible that war is going to be, but even before Lincoln was elected, Scott didn't vote in the election He announced who he would have voted for, but he never went and voted. He said he would voted. He said he would have voted for the John Bell ticket, but since he was the head of the army, he wanted to remain politically neutral and nonpartisan. And that was the moment where he tries to remain above the fray. And he says, you know what? This is going to lead to a horrible war. And his projections get more and more sophisticated over the next 6 months. He starts predicting how many are going to die. He's the closest to being right. He's even way, way low. He projects how big of an army you're going to need. He's way low, but he's closer than anyone else to being right. He projects how long the war is going to be. He's closer than anyone else, and he's still low. I mean, it's amazing how prophetic he gets with his projections. He's giving this advice to Buchanan. So it's important to note, I mean, Buchanan's getting some good advice on this as we head into the crisis. It's scary, this advice. You know, at one point, Scott tells him, he says, if we have a civil war in this country, it's going to be worse than the intestine civil wars of Mexico that we've just seen. And so he's very concerned about this. Now, Buchanan doesn't strike the blow toward a war that would reap the dead of roughly 3% of the American population. He avoided both of those things, but he also did not preserve the antebellum Union itself by avoiding the issuance of a strong military threat. Here we go. Now we've got to look backwards. A direct, strongly worded statement about the use of military force to defend the Constitution as commander-in-chief by directly coercing a state was not in Buchanan's vocabulary of strict constructionism for the Constitution. And nationwide, military preparations were not made to raise the militia under his presidency. They were not. But another lesson is that Buchanan's failure to avert secession was also a failure of Congress, the American political party nominating system, and even exposed some of the weaknesses of the U.S. Electoral College system in 1860. And this long process began with the implosion of the Whig Party, which had bi-regional support in the 1840s, and ended with the explosion of the Democratic Party in two wings in the presidential election season of 1860. One primarily Northern under Stephen Douglas, and the other primarily Southern under John Breckinridge. The Electoral College system in 1860 made possible a regional candidate winning the presidency, and that is precisely what happened in a free, open, democratic election. By the time of the 1860 election, the Democratic Party had split and nominated two candidates, not one. This was far from being Buchanan's fault alone. And it's worth remembering that while Lincoln was democratically elected overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, he only won a plurality of the popular vote. The other votes were divided between his three challengers, two Democrats and a Constitutional Union Party candidate. But our presidential election of 1860 and its outcome did not channel the issue of secession or slavery back into a peaceful democratic process successfully. Perhaps a cross-regional candidate might have, or perhaps a president willing to exercise greater military threats earlier could have arrested the crisis. Yet, with that statement, it's worth walking down the historical comparison to Old Hickory himself. So let's do that. Who else dealt with who else? I mean, he dealt with the secession crisis in South Carolina in the early 1830s. Let's take a look at what good old Hickory does. It's probably also worthwhile for us to briefly compare Buchanan to other presidents. Okay, so Andrew Jackson's preparations and martial threats in the early 1830s during the South Carolina nullification crisis are worth revisiting. I got to get ready for this. Okay, everybody. Okay. Hang every leader of that infatuated people, sir, by martial law, irrespective of his name or political or social position, and that disunion by armed force is treason. He ordered his Secretary of War to prepare a militia to invade South Carolina and the United States Navy to send ships to South Carolina. Jackson's response was the right response for the moment, and his threats, as well as careful compromise on reducing the original tariff in Congress during the nullification crisis, worked. Yeah, it's important that that final part get remembered too. Like we always remember the saber rattling of Jackson, but we don't also remember that the tariff does go through at a lower level. Eventually, that's negotiated, which helps a lot. Buchanan was not Andrew Jackson, and South Carolina was alone in the 1830s. This is also important. It was not alone in 1861. Okay, the situation is very different that Buchanan is encountering. The plane is very different. The conditions, the context, and the upper South of Virginia and North Carolina stood on the edge of evaluating the situation and viewing it through the lens of federal coercion of the states in 1861. The bellicose threats of Andy Jackson would not likely have had the same effect in 1860 with South Carolina, but it was still correct in its course of action for the Democratic Party president trying to hold the Union together in the 1830s. By the 1860s, the South was more united in its conviction and behind slavery, and the Democratic Party as a national institution was weaker, having lost significant support in the northern states. So, if Buchanan was looking for the party or party politics to help save the Union, the answer needed to come before Lincoln's election, perhaps by rallying his own party to one national cross-regional candidate. This was something that did not happen. But it is also worth remembering that in 1860, a fusion of Douglas and Bell tickets, or Douglas and Breckinridge, would have had more popular votes than the Republicans, but not enough electoral college votes to win either. If you look at the data, even a fusion would have given you more popular votes, but not enough electoral college votes to win. That is fascinating. That one fascinates my students a great deal in class. That look at that election and the possibility of other alternatives there. Now, by comparison, South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, and was followed by 6 additional states in early January and early February. The Confederate States was formed at the beginning of February with alacrity, and during this period, Buchanan avoided the bellicose language and military mobilization used by Andrew Jackson against South Carolina. This restraint by Buchanan might have prevented the Upper South from leaving the Union even sooner. Aggressive language or attempts at militia mobilization may have driven all-important Virginia out of the Union months sooner. Or the aggressive language might have done little, but we do know that Lincoln's call for volunteers, that call did push 4 states to make the decision that they made. That rage militaire that came of volunteers that spring of 1861. It took months to train the Union Army. It took years for Lincoln to find Ulysses S. Grant. So any military preparations on a mass scale would be a clear move toward a wider war. Coercion that would lead to further secession in January and February. As the Union disintegrated, Buchanan's own cabinet blew apart over secession, the Fort Sumter issue. Bellicose language or armed maneuvers could have accelerated the timetable of the war and mobilization for both sides, but would have been unlikely to have averted the war entirely at that late stage. Andrew Jackson was a bombastic populist who built the Democratic Party in his own cultish image. He was also committed to a vision of federal and at times executive supremacy. And he was also a strong defender of a perpetual union under the Constitution. Jackson could be a blunt instrument, however. Buchanan, on the other hand, was not. James Buchanan, in contrast, was a strict constitutional constructionist and an advocate of states' rights, and believed that containing divisive issues like slavery to the states was the best way to preserve a diverse union. James Buchanan was not an iconoclast. If anything, he was the definition of a traditionalist in his public presentation and mannerisms, even in his diligent care for his orphaned nieces and nephews. He was a lifelong bachelor whose niece, Harriet Lane, served as his first lady. He was an 18th century man governing a 19th century existential political crisis. In the 1860s, slavery and secession, however, were the intertwined issues of the day for Buchanan's presidency, while Jackson in the 1830s was the nullification of a federal tariff, not a threat to the slavery institution itself. And in other words, Buchanan's challenge was far more vast and complex. In December 1860, South Carolina's secession was a direct response to Lincoln's election. These secessionists believed him to be a direct threat to slavery's existence everywhere. Secession was not a direct response to Buchanan's own actions during his lame duck period. Buchanan had little chance of preventing that election when his own party was split. And Buchanan, appeared to take a do no harm approach to the remainder of the states as they debated unionism and secession. But Americans do not like the impression of an impotent president or politician. And Buchanan seemed that way in December of 1860 and January of 1861. He's being punished ever since for his seemingly weak approach to the secession crisis as a result. After Lincoln's inauguration, Buchanan retired to Wheatland, his home in Lancaster, and was rarely seen in public. He worked assiduously on his memoirs as a way to defend his presidency, his political actions. His memoirs, published in 1866, but they do little to retrieve his public reputation from where it had been. He dies June 1st, 1868, of respiratory failure, at the age of 77. It's worth noting that Lincoln, despite his best efforts, was unable until his second term to secure a prominent Southerner who currently lived in and represented a seceding state to his own cabinet. Andrew Johnson, U.S. Senator from Tennessee. Both Edward Bates and Montgomery Blair were living in slaveholding states in the first cabinet, but those states, Missouri and Maryland, despite deep division, remained in the Union. Now, winning the American Revolution and securing the peace of a new fledgling republic gave us Washington. The Great Depression and World War II gave us Franklin Roosevelt. The Civil War, ending slavery, preserving the Union, fortunately gave us, eventually, Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. But blaming James Buchanan alone for secession, the historical problems of slavery in America, or the spark for the Civil War is not taking a very wide or careful analytical lens to these historical challenges either. The American presidency is a powerful one, for sure, but it is not all powerful. And Buchanan was a reserved man in social mores, his attire, but he was not a man set to be a wartime president or one that could envision an end to the antebellum Union that was a slaveholding union. It's not especially surprising that a man who was comfortable with a more reserved and even courtly forum in society was closest with Southerners in his cabinet. But the historical truth is that no one individual in American history could or did prevent secession or civil war in America. These stubborn, intractable problems would lead to a new birth of freedom of roughly 4 million enslaved people. Yet they would also lead to the death of 750,000 Americans, an incredibly high price to pay. And that doesn't even begin to account for the poverty and disability of generations and the violence and advances of Reconstruction America. All these consequences of a civil war on American battlefields in 1860 and 1861. Thank you very much.